Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the Paycheck Protection Program. Today's webinar is hosted by the Mohawk Valley Small Business Development Center, and your presenter is Center Director Roxanne Mutchler. We also have Zach from Mohawk Valley SBDC joining us to help moderate the chat. He'll also be sending out links referenced in the chat section of your GoToWebinar panel. I'm your moderator, Renee Goodnow from the New York SBDC. Today's presentation section may take up the full hour. We will be happy to stay on longer, though, to help answer any questions that we can. And with that, I will hand things over to you, Roxanne.
Thank you, Renee, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. Here's Renee Goodnow, our social media guru and expert for the New York Small Business Development Center. We thank you so much, Renee, for facilitating and moderating all of our webinars. She does a great job. And here's our team at our home offices. That's me right there in the top left. And a lot of you have talked with Zach over these last few weeks. And as Renee said, he's behind the scenes supporting me on today's webinar. Our other business advisors, there's Senior Business Advisor Dave Lerman, Paul Arventides, Shelby Sweet, our Government Contracting Coordinator, Gina Hayduk, and our team wouldn't be complete without our colleagues at the Thinkubator. There's Director Ryan Miller and Co-Director Stacy Smith. So Stacy actually captured this photo collage a few weeks ago at one of our first virtual meetings. But without further ado, I know you want me to get to the meat of our webinar today, so I'm going to say something my son-in-law always likes to say: let's get this party started. Here's our game plan for today. I'll start with a quick recap of the events of the last 6 to 7 weeks, and then we'll do a real quick review of the expenses that are eligible and not eligible for forgiveness, just so that we're all on the same page. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on things we've already discussed in past webinars, but just as a quick review, go over those. We've had many questions over the past month. We appreciate your patience as we sometimes have had to ask for clarification from the SBA to answer your questions. So we've had to, like I said, submit to them to get some clarifications, and we still may need to do that in the days and the weeks ahead. People think a lot of times that we are the SBA, but we are actually what the SBA calls their resource partners, one of their resource partners, along with the Women's Business Centers and SCORE chapters. So SBA provides us with our funding, federal funding, so that we can assist you free of charge. We also get funding from the state through Empire State Development. And most SBDCs are located on a SUNY campus. And so our SUNYs give us a lot of in-kind support. In our case, MVCC is our host institution, and we appreciate them so much for our office space and other in-kind things that they do for us. So the loan forgiveness slides I know will be of much interest to you, so we'll go over those. We've had many clients calling us. They're very concerned. They want to make sure that they can get their loan in its entirety forgiven if possible. So we get that. And so that was one of the big reasons why we decided to offer this webinar today to you, to help you get the best prepared that you can to request forgiveness for your PPP loan. We'll wrap up with some tips from our advisors and web links for your future reference. And as usual, as Renee said, we'll definitely make the webinar recording available to you and the slides as well, as I guess she's already provided to you. So it was way back on March 13, which to me seems like forever ago, that the president made a disaster declaration for all of our states. And that opened the door for you to apply for that economic injury disaster loan that some people call the EIDL. Then on March 27, the CARES Act was approved, which, as you know, provided that first round of funding for the PPP. That CARES Act was an estimated $2 trillion package, which specifically allotted $10 billion for the EIDLs and $349 billion for the PPP to help you, our small business people. And as you know, those funds did run out in less than 2 weeks. There was a second interim rule posted on April 3rd. And then there have been other interim rules throughout these last few weeks. I'm not going to talk about all of them. They're going to be on a slide at the very end. But that April 24 one, that was the new PPP and Healthcare Enhancement Act that provided that additional $310 billion for PPP and $60 billion for the EIDL. So that was April 24, just a week ago. This past Monday, banks resumed accepting PPP loan applications. Again, we are aware that many of our local banks have decided not to accept any more applications at this time. They're just trying to handle all that they've accepted up to this point. If you need a referral for a bank, maybe you haven't applied yet for this program, do contact us or an SBDC near you, and we'll definitely give you some referrals that you could investigate. So that information, again, it will be on one of the ending slides. So let's review real quickly. Here's the list of payroll costs that are eligible for forgiveness. So many of you had questions about what it was not eligible, and this is the list as of today. So I watched the webinar that the SBA hosted on Tuesday, and this was the same. They provided the same information for you. The banks, they are going to be the ones that determine the loan forgiveness. So we encourage you, and I'll be saying this throughout the webinar, we encourage you to work with your bank to determine what is eligible. It really is ultimately going to be up to them. Although I know many of you are going to say, you're probably saying it right now, but my bank doesn't even know. They don't have the answers on some of my questions. And the SBA is going to, we're told, be coming out with some clarifications. We hope that comes out very soon because we still continue to get many questions. But what we're doing today is just telling you what we know as of today. So the information that we're providing you is either out of one of the interim final rules, which is published in the Federal Register, or it came right from an SBA representative or a handout that they have given to us. So again, we're waiting for more forgiveness guidelines. So we had a lot of questions about how to calculate payroll costs. The interim final rule said to total your payroll costs from the last 12 months. Then the SBA came out with an FAQs document on April 6th that stated the payroll costs could be calculated based on either the prior 12 months or 2019 calendar data. So that was a little bit, that was one of the confusing points early on. But this is what we know as of today as far as determining your payroll costs. Let's quickly review what payroll costs are not eligible for forgiveness. And this, again, has been a real challenge to determine and find out what exactly is going to be forgiven and what is not eligible for being forgiven. So obviously compensation over $100,000 for an employee, that's an easy one. Payroll employer side federal employment taxes. So not eligible are the employer's federal employment taxes for the employees, so their costs for FICA and Medicare. The employee federal tax withholding may be included as payroll costs. So an example that I have here is an employee who earned $4,000 per month in gross wages, $500 was taken out in federal taxes. So that would count as $4,000 in payroll costs. Even though the employee receives $3,500, $500 is paid to the federal government. However, the employer side federal payroll taxes imposed on that $4,000 in wages, they are excluded. So this is right out of the CARES Act interim final rule. Okay, so you can see the rest of the list here. Any questions we can go over at a later date. I know one point I have on my notes here is Zach shared with me at one point, he, as you know, has been fielding questions right along with the business advisors and myself. And he suggested to many of you to use gross payroll minus the employer's share of federal payroll taxes, disability and or unemployment insurance, payroll processing fees, and workers' comp. And that should be a good estimate. So we will be covering if you got a loan already and you find now that you're not going to be able to meet that estimate that you could come up with for payroll, we will definitely talk about that. So again, just to reiterate, we suggest that you consult with your lender to ensure you are following their requirements for forgiveness. And I realize they may come back and say they still are waiting for those guidelines. So as you know, 75% should be the payroll costs for your PPP loan. But as you know, there are other expenses that you can apply for forgiveness for: interest payment on your mortgage, payment of a rent or lease, payments on utilities. The utilities has been something we've had a lot of questions on. Shelby Sweet of our office brought up the point that if somebody has a bill that includes a utility tax on the bill, then that should certainly be acceptable. The PPP is federal monies. So what Zach and Paul from our office did is they actually looked into the IRS definition of utility, since we're talking federal dollars here. And for the IRS's definition, it included gas, electric, water, heating oil, garbage collection, which was surprising, residential telephone service, cell phone service, cable television, and internet service. So what we're telling people is to track your expenses that you are hoping will qualify for forgiveness and have them ready to present to the bank at the time that you apply for forgiveness. So the bank, again, will determine if those expenses qualify for forgiveness. So the Act established that the borrower is eligible for loan forgiveness equal to the amount spent by the borrower during an 8-week period following the disbursement of the PPP loan. So there was a lot of question early on, when does that 8-week period start? Can I decide what my 8-week period is? And it came down to the fact that the 8-week period started upon disbursement of the PPP loan. The maximum amount that can be forgiven may not exceed the principal amount of the loan, obviously. And the performance period begins immediately following the loan proceeds. So I guess that's a little bit redundant there. So we're going to get into slides about loan forgiveness. And there are 4 factors that are considered in determining if your loan will be 100% forgiven. So we want to do everything we can to help you to be able to get to that point where after your 8-week period, you're able to get your loan fully forgiven. So you're going to want to read and review your loan documents very, very carefully. So in some cases, some of our clients have actually been kind enough to share their loan documents with us. In some cases, we've seen an actual section that says Paycheck Protection Program, which was nice to see. In other cases, we're just, there's just a couple lines under a section called repayment terms. So some banks are spelling out some specific guidelines. Others aren't really providing much on the loan document, which is a little disconcerting. Some of the loan documents, we saw one in particular where it actually specified when they wanted that borrower to submit to the lender their request for forgiveness along with their proof. So be very, very diligent in finding out when it's required that you apply for the forgiveness. Is it the last day of your 8-week period? Do you have by June 30? You know, when is the bank going to require? Because you want to make sure that you're doing everything that the bank is going to require in order to get the forgiveness that you would like. So we're going to talk about each one of these individually. We'll start with the first one, payroll limitation. We'll talk about the head count, salary and wage reduction limitation, and then those other expenses. So 75% payroll limitation. If you spend at least 75% of your loan on payroll costs, the entirety of the loan is eligible for forgiveness. Now, the entirety of the loan would only be forgiven if the remainder of the funds are spent on other qualifying expenses. So that's a caveat there. If you spend less than 75% of your PPP loan on payroll costs, some people were very, very concerned. We've had a couple calls of late where people were concerned that they would not be able to get any portion of the loan forgiven. But what will actually happen if you spend less than 75% of your loan on payroll? The maximum amount that can be forgiven is decreased. So it's decreased pro rata based on the payroll costs as a percentage of the PPP loan compared to 75%. So let's take a look at an example. This is something Shelby shared with me, an article she saw online by a lawyer on LinkedIn. His name is Jason Ackerman, and he actually, we took this from an article that he wrote. So again, I do have to qualify and say to all of you that we're giving you these guidelines, but you really need to be talking with your bank. And hopefully, like I said, they'll get some more direction very, very soon. But these are just examples of the way that we're interpreting what we know as of today. So if Company A receives PPP funds of $10,000, and they spend that whole $10,000, they spend $5,000 on payroll, $4,000 on rent, and $1,000 on utilities. So that totals the $10,000. But as you can see, the $5,000 on payroll is not 75% of the loan. So the maximum forgiveness is the $5,000 divided by 75%, which is $6,666. Let's go to the head count for loan forgiveness. If you keep all of your employees, the entirety of the loan may be forgiven. So this is the goal, that the spirit of the law is that you bring back all of your employees if you've laid them off, and if you haven't, that you keep them all. If you've already laid off some employees, you can still be forgiven for the full amount of your payroll costs if you rehire them by June 30. That second line there is right from the SBA. They confirmed this, that you won't be penalized, just like I said, for a reduction in employment or wages during the period from February 15th to April 26th if you rehire employees that you previously laid off or restore any decrease in wages or salaries by June 30. So again, they just want, the whole idea of the legislation and the funding is to bring people back. And I know what you're all thinking, and a lot of you are saying, you know, that your employees are, if they've been laid off, they're on unemployment and they're making a lot more money. But we're not going to go there today. I know that is definitely an issue for a lot of you, but we can get into that a little bit on Q&A if we have the time. Let's see. Oh, good point that again Zach made to me, and his point was that although you won't be penalized specifically due to a reduction in employment or salaries as long as they're restored by June 30, a delay in bringing your employees back will likely result in your payroll expenses being lower than you predicted, and therefore could result in a proportional reduction of your loan forgiveness. So keep that in mind as you decide what to do in these next couple months. That last line there is per Jeff Boyce. He's our very new SBA project officer for the New York State SBDC program. That again, the loan forgiveness will be proportionally reduced if you don't maintain the headcount and if you reduce salaries by more than 25%. So again, it's a prorated thing. You wouldn't lose out totally on forgiveness. So for an example, I've got my notes here to compare your headcount in your 8-week period to the headcount in your chosen base period. And if it's gone down, you're going to decrease your forgivable portion in the same ratio. So, but again, if you bring back your headcount number up to that original number by June 30, you won't need to be concerned about your forgivable amount decreasing. The salary and wage reduction limitation. Again, this was so that employers do not reduce an employee's wages by more than 25%. So if you want to get that full forgiveness, then do keep this in mind. And again, if you restore any salary or wage reduction made between February 15th and April 26th to its February 15 level by June 30, again, you won't need to be concerned about your forgivable amount decreasing. So if you decrease an employee's wages during the 8-week period by more than 25% as compared to the most recent full quarter of employment for that employee, the forgivable portion is decreased dollar for dollar by the decrease to the employee's wages that exceeds 25%. And then lastly, for loan forgiveness, some of you, I know a lot of you are using the PPP for payroll, which is certainly its intent. But as you know, you can apply for forgiveness on other expenses, and they can't make up more than 25% of the forgiven amount. So Zach helped me with these examples for you. Example 1, this is certainly what you want to have happen, where your company receives a PPP loan of, let's say, $100,000, and you spend 75% of that on payroll, so you're meeting that 75% requirement. You can claim no more than $25,000 of other qualifying expenses for forgiveness. So 75 spent on payroll, the 25,000 on other qualifying expenses. Therefore, your maximum forgiveness would be the $100,000 if those $25,000 in other qualifying expenses are indeed allowable. Example 2, however, you've got company D that receives that same $100,000 loan. They only spend $60,000 on payroll. So that's not, of course, 75% of $100,000. So they may claim no more than $20,000 of other qualifying expenses for forgiveness. So if you take that $60,000 for payroll and divide that by 75%, that's $80,000. So that's why you can, the maximum forgiveness is the $80,000, 60 for payroll and 20 for the other qualifying expenses. So now we're going to move into how do you apply for forgiveness of the loan. So we've shared this before in the past. For the loan to be forgiven, you must make a request to the lender for forgiveness by providing documentation. And we're going to actually go over that more specifically in the next slide. The lender has 60 days to review and approve your request. And this is something we've said before as well, that if you received an EIDL grant and a PPP loan, it's our understanding that that EIDL grant will be subtracted from the amount of the Paycheck Protection loan that is forgivable. One point I want to make here is I'm going to read this right from the interim final rule. where it says, can lenders rely on borrower documentation for loan forgiveness? So can the banks rely on your documentation for loan forgiveness? And the answer is yes. And I quote, the lender does not need to conduct any verification if the borrower submits documentation supporting its request for loan forgiveness and attests that it has accurately verified the payments for eligible costs. The administrator will hold harmless any lender, that's the bank, that relies on such borrower documents and attestation from a borrower. The administrator, in consultation with the secretary, has determined that lender reliance on a borrower's required documents and attestation is necessary and appropriate in light of Section 1106H of the Act, which prohibits the administrator from taking an enforcement action or imposing penalties if the lender has received a borrower attestation. So we're going to talk about record keeping and putting together your documentation so that when you go into your bank, you've got all your ducks in a row and you can just set your file down and show your banker all of the proof that you have on the expenses that you paid with your PPP funds, so that they will just see how super organized you are and just say, yes, your loan will be entirely forgiven. So let's talk about what you will want to prepare to be ready to apply for forgiveness. First and foremost, a borrower certification is required to be submitted to your lender with your request. So this is, again, out of the CARES Act, Section 1106. So you're just testifying actually to the fact that you needed this loan in order to meet your expenses and continue your business. So the law says that you are certifying that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. We'll talk in a few minutes about how this was not the case for some of the people that did receive funding. But as I said a moment ago, the interim final rule does say that the lenders will rely on your certification in order to determine eligibility of you, the borrower, and the use of the loan proceeds. And they will rely on your documents to determine eligibility for loan forgiveness. So that will be a very important and required document. So there it is in the first bullet here on our next slide. So what you're going to need also is quite a bit of documentation. You should submit Form 941 and state quarterly wage unemployment insurance tax reporting forms or equivalent payroll processor records that best corresponds to the covered period, with evidence of any retirement and health insurance contributions. So I think that was taken right out of the rule. Also for those other expenses, evidence of business rent, business mortgage interest, etc., if you're applying for forgiveness of those other expenses. So again, your documentation can be payroll tax filings. You'll want to be able to show your number of FTEs and your pay rates. Proof of those other expenses, proof of lease payments, mortgage payments, the interest on mortgage payments, proof of your utility payments. And that proof can be a bank statement or canceled checks. You want to have it all very organized and prepared for your bank. Okay, so what is the maturity date of the loan? The maturity is 2 years. So they feel that, and I'll quote the rule here, considerable economic disruption caused by the coronavirus is expected to abate well before the 2-year maturity date, such that borrowers will be able to recommence business operations and pay off any outstanding balances on their PPP within that time frame. So I hope that that is true and that we can all get back to business very soon. But if you have any PPP loan funds that you've not repaid or that have not been forgiven, then it will become a 2-year loan at a 1% interest rate. Again, it's fully guaranteed by the SBA. One point here is that I'm just hearing in the last day or two that some people are being notified by their banks. I just had one actually this morning who called me, and if you have an EIDL, if you were a recipient of an EIDL loan by April 3rd, then they're requiring that that loan be used to refinance your PPP loan. So you'd have to take your EIDL loan and refinance it into the PPP loan. But I don't know that we have anybody that we know. A lot of the people that we know of did not receive their EIDL monies. A lot of them haven't even received their EIDL loan yet. They've just received the advanced part of that EIDL. So for the most part, I don't think that's applicable to a lot of us in our area. Okay. Most of the people that we are talking to, they're using, like I said, the PPP for payroll costs and the EIDL loan for those working capital. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move to giving you some record keeping tips that we hope will be helpful to you. So if you are here listening today or listening to the recording and you've applied for the PPP, but you have not yet received funding or even an announcement that you've been approved for it, ask your lender if they are automatically processing your application now that they've gotten those additional appropriated monies. So the only way to find out the status on your PPP loan application is to check with your bank, and they can tell you what the status is of it. So as I said earlier, if you need a referral for a lender, just let us know. But we do encourage you to move quickly because, again, that additional appropriation could potentially be used up pretty quickly. I may have already said to make sure that you read and understand your loan and forgiveness terms before signing your closing documents. And like I said, questions, direct them right to your banker. So it's absolutely critical, that reading of the loan documents, so you have a good understanding of what the bank is requiring of you. And just work with them to get the answers. And I know they may come back, like I said, and say we're waiting for more information, but they will at some point be given more clarification. So again, you must be very, very organized with the use of the funds. And we recommend that you work with your accountant to come up with the best way to track these monies that you get and expenses that you're going to be paying using the PPP monies. Some people are just using an Excel spreadsheet. Whatever works. We recommend keeping the funds in a separate account, separate from your other accounts, and to keep a record of all expenses for which you plan to request forgiveness. So this way, as you're going along through your 8-week period, as you pay for things, you put them in your folder by category. Okay, this goes into a little bit more detail. Monitoring your expenses weekly, we feel, will be an important thing to do, whether you do it or your accountant does it. But do monitor your expenses weekly. And as I said, even if it's just an Excel spreadsheet, that will work. You want to be able to project your payroll over the 8-week period. You want to also establish a report that is generated from your payroll runs. So that report should separate out the employer portion of payroll taxes and put that in a separate column on the spreadsheet, because you want to be able to understand how much of your payroll is it going to be your responsibility to pay that will not be part of the forgiven payroll costs. And again, just keep on track every week with that spreadsheet. Okay, watch head count, because as you know, that's going to be important. Shelby actually pointed out, you can't pay less, you can't pay employees less, employees more money each and get the full forgiveness. So the FTE, the point here being that the FTE is important to be able to show that you brought back or retained the same number of employees. So that's definitely an important point. I suggest putting dates in your online calendar or whatever you use for keeping track of appointments. You want to put in a date to remind you to start preparing your documents for submission. Ideally, doing it every week would be great. The date for which you need to apply for forgiveness. If your bank does give you if they do say to you, as soon as your 8-week period is over, we need to see you, then get that appointment in your calendar and have it remind you. We actually had viewed a closing document from a client where it was actually pointed out that they must request forgiveness 60 days after receipt of the funds. So on the 60th day of the loan is what it said. So, each bank is going to be different. You need to find out from your bank, what they're going to require. Now, all of us have heard these stories about these big companies that have gotten big PPP loans. And it was Treasury Secretary Mnuchin on Wednesday came out with the fact that they're definitely going to be looking into who got PPP loans over $2 million, and they're going to be investigated. And so he said on Fox Business Network that it was questionable whether some larger companies qualified for the PPP. So he did admit that there was a real question there as to whether they qualified based on the self-certification step in the loan process that I mentioned to you, where you're certifying that you do need these funds to be able to keep your business going. He said that businesses need to look carefully at their applications to be sure they can certify that the forgivable loan is necessary. So there was almost 250 publicly traded companies that received PPP loans valued at a total of $905 million. So what happened, it actually was a client that this morning told me about an email she received that they've actually come out, it actually was in an interim rule April 24, which I don't remember reading this section of that interim rule, that actually said that the borrowers can repay a loan in full by May 7, and that they will be deemed by the SBA to have made the required certification in good faith. So it's giving these companies that really were not eligible for a PPP loan, it's giving them some time here up until May 7 to give back those monies, or they could potentially be audited and prosecuted for misuse of the funds. So that's a good thing that, they're at least trying to, make amends for all of those companies that received monies that may not have been truly eligible to receive. Okay, we're almost done here. This next slide is a listing of all the interim rules that have been posted. This is right from the Treasury's website. So if you have a question, maybe about affiliation, or that last one that came out with some additional criteria for seasonal employees, you can just go to that website and click on the rule that you want to look into. And then here are just some links for you for reference. The second two links there are, again, right from the Treasury website. So you can be confident that you're reading accurate information if you go to those bottom two links there. And as Renee pointed out, we're the Mohawk Valley SPDC, so we would be glad to work with you. We cover the counties of Oneida, Madison, Herkimer, and Montgomery counties. But if you're not within that blueprint, any one of our SBDCs would be glad to work with you. There's probably one near you because we have 22 centers all around the state. So for the one nearest you, just click on that link and you can look up the one that's closest to you. And there we go. So I hope that you have found this helpful. Again, we're just wanted to bring together the information as we know it for today. You know, who knows what might transpire in the next week or two, but if anything were to change, I assure you we'll get that out to you via our newsletter. And Zach's the newsletter man. He does a fabulous job getting that out every Thursday afternoon, and we've even put out some extra ones when it's been important enough to communicate something to you. So we'll definitely keep you informed of any changes, and hopefully we'll get even more detailed information, like I said, in the days ahead. But I'll turn it over to Zach and Renee for any questions.
Great, thank you, Roxanne. I'll start with the first one. Can you please verify which payroll taxes are eligible for forgiveness?
So let me go back to that slide. Eligible for forgiveness. So the employees' salaries, including the employees' federal tax withholding, wages, commissions, or similar compensation. So that's what's eligible. What wasn't eligible was the employer's federal taxes. So the employer's FICA and Medicare. So whatever the employee's federal tax withholdings are, those are eligible.
Thank you. And should those be the gross or net wages?
Gross.
We'd like some clarification on invoices paid and eligible. For example, are utility costs incurred during the 8 weeks or paid in the 8 weeks? For example, a utility bill that I paid today, but was for the month of April prior to when I received my loan proceeds.
That's a really, really good question. And Zach and I had this conversation before the webinar, because thank you to that person that did email that up to us just an hour or two ago. This has been a little sticky to be able to understand, because as she rightly knew, it's costs incurred and paid within the 8-week period. So for payroll, we've had some clients that have actually decided to, run a payroll a little early in order to be able to get it, if it was for that 1 week, not waiting till the week after their 8-week period, but paying for it within the week that it was paying for. So some clients are, and I know all of you do want to follow the letter of the law, and that's excellent. We don't really know when it comes to like your utilities. Again, a lot of times we're paying for the prior month's utilities. So it's something that we really are going to refer people to go back to their bank and get clarification on, and see what the bank, how they, interpret the law, and just have everything there so that put together everything that you want to apply for forgiveness, and then see what the bank will approve for forgiveness. But that's a tough one because of the way it's written. It has to be costs incurred and paid within the 8-week period. So I do understand where they're coming from. Zach, please pop in if you want to add anything to what I'm saying, and you too, Renee, because this is definitely we've all, as advisors, have collaborated with each other on different questions that have come in.
Roxanne, on the incurred and paid rule, I think that seems the intention of the policy was to allow, for example, for 2 months worth of a given utilities expenses to be included. And I think the question comes down to how the banks are going to interpret that. And so if I were a business that was preparing my documents to present to a bank for forgiveness, I would probably be looking at including that first utility bill that came due during the time period, even though it wasn't incurred during the time period.
Right,
And I would
exactly.
also look at the last one that was incurred during the time period but not paid until afterwards, and
Yes,
present all three to the bank and allow them to make the determination.
yes, very good, Zach. Thank you for adding that.
This person, in something they read, it was said transportation costs can also be forgiven as part of the 25% of the PPP. If so, what does transportation cover?
We do not have clarification on transportation costs. If you're a business that does incur transportation costs, we recommend that you track those, and then again, prepare to present those to the bank, because we don't have any more information other than just what you read, Renee, transportation costs.
What do businesses like college towns do if the university is not bringing students back until August or September? They have no customers, therefore they will not be able to utilize the 8-week period since they cannot bring their employees back.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, it's a business that they're not going to be able to reopen because they are a business that is there for students. So if a business is not able to reopen or bring their employees back, that could be a situation where they make the determination that they either will not take the PPP loan if it's offered, or return it if they've accepted the loan.
But just to clarify, again, this is Zach, just to clarify, that business certainly could accept the funds and pay their employees to not work. And that wouldn't be against the rules. It's just up to the employer to decide whether or not that's something they want to do.
Yes, excellent. Zach's absolutely right. Thank you, Zach. That's a good point. And that brings up that discussion that we've had with so many of our clients. They want to bring back their employees, but we had one client that they're going to bring them back, but they're going to be sitting home for a couple weeks. But that's okay, because this whole legislation was to get our employees back to work. And we realize too that, as I said earlier, that there's some people that will not want to come back to work because of getting a pretty good size unemployment check. And as one of our legislators said to me, that increased benefit for unemployment was, it's actually what she called an unintended consequence. So we realize the situation that a lot of employers are facing right now. But thank you, Zach. That's absolutely true, and a very good point that they certainly could do that. Whole idea being get people, back to work and on the payroll. Thank you.
Can you hire additional people and get it to count towards the 75%? I'm not sure if it's in describing hiring additional people or
yes, I don't know why
bringing other people back.
Yeah, they're not going to be looking at individual names of people that you brought back. The same individuals are going to be looking at FTE count, full-time equivalent. So they want to see that you've brought back the same number of people compared to your base period. I don't see any problem with hiring more people. That would be really, really wonderful to be able to bring back more people. I'm not hearing that that's the case for a lot of our small businesses, but that would be a wonderful thing, and they certainly could do that. Would you agree on that, Zach?
I think so, yes. The only question I would have is if that pushed their payroll above the expected amount, based on the calculations they utilized in determining the amount they qualified for, will that increase the amount that they could potentially have forgiven on the payroll side? I don't know the answer to that question.
Right. Yeah.
But it certainly would help them achieve that maximum forgiveness of 75%.
Sure. Yeah. Good questions.
Is it acceptable to spend 100% of PPP on qualified payroll items, not just the 75?
Roxanne, I think this is a sort of gets to the same issue as the previous question, which is that in order to do that, you'd be needing to increase your payroll.
Yeah.
Because of the way it's calculated, the only way that you could get above that 75% is to either increase your staffing levels or increase the pay that you're giving to your current staff.
Mhm.
And again, I haven't seen any guidance from the SBA that would explicitly suggest that it cannot be done, nor have I seen it spelled out that it's allowable.
Right. What we've come up against, speaking to this, is a couple clients that have actually been approved for a PPP loan where they've realized now that they're not going to be able to meet that 75% for payroll costs, probably because early on they may have included like workers' comp costs and other things that now we found out are not allowable expenses. So on the other side, that's what we're hearing more so than having too much in the way of payroll costs. But again, a good question.
I think the question of having, a higher payroll cost than expected is probably one that the business is ultimately going to have to consult with their lender on to see how the lender is interpreting the guidelines that SBA is providing.
Exactly.
You. Does payroll cost include bonuses to employees and owners when calculating if you spent the 75% of the loan on payroll?
So that again is very similar to what we've been talking about, where you're going to be in, you can do that, you can pay people more, but it's going to be inflating your payroll costs. The only thing that we've been seeing is a decrease in loan forgiveness if you decrease people's wages more than 25%. But I haven't seen anything that would prevent somebody from paying more than, except what Zach's already talked about as far as the considerations that you want to look at if you do that.
What if June 30th is beyond their 8 weeks?
So I'm not sure what they're asking as far as going for requesting the loan forgiveness. If it's before June 30, they really need to talk with their bank as to, when does the bank want them to request the loan forgiveness? Is it going to be right at the end of maybe the end of their 8-week period is, June 15. They need to, talk with their bank as to the steps that they should take to request loan forgiveness. Am I answering the question correctly? Everybody's 8-week period is different. It's true that not everybody's 8-week period will end on June 30. It's going to be, it depends on when they received their PPP funds.
What if we decrease salary to 60% on April 10th? And why do they specify that it cannot be below 75%?
They're not wanting people to, have their pay decrease. They want people to get back to work at the same level that they were at for the base period. They are allowing, a little bit of a decrease without, losing out on any loan forgiveness. But anything above 25%, that's a decrease. They are going to not be able to get the loan 100% forgiven. So if they have to take that into consideration.
Does payroll payments to partners qualify towards loan forgiveness?
Payroll payments to who?
To partners.
Partners. So I guess that depends on if they're on. It doesn't sound like they're on the payroll. So this is all pertaining to people who are on the payroll and getting a paycheck through the payroll process. You know what? Hold on just one sec. I'm not clear if they're talking about, is that a partnership situation? Actually need a little bit more clarification on that because there are guidelines for sole proprietors for this program. So we probably would want to talk with that person offline separately to get a little bit more information. Unless, Zach, do you have anything you want to add on that?
I agree with you, Roxanne. We may need to find out a little bit more about their case specifically. In general terms, business owner, whether it's a sole proprietor or partners, should still be eligible for this program and should still be able to pay themselves, even if it's not through a traditional payroll process.
Mhm. So I just looked this up for the interim final rule for sole proprietors. And as Zach just pointed out again, you're also eligible for a loan if you're an individual who operates under a sole proprietorship or as an independent contractor or eligible self-employed individual, and you were in operation on February 15. So it says you would submit documentation as is necessary to establish eligibility, such as that's the payroll records, Form 1099, or income and expenses from a sole proprietorship. If you don't have such documentation, you would provide other supporting documentation, such as bank records, sufficient to demonstrate the qualifying payroll amount. The 2019 Form 1040 Schedule C that was provided at the time of the loan application must be used to determine the amount of net profit allocated. So they go by the net profit. Schedule C, to determine the amount of net profit allocated to the owner during the covered period for the reasons described. So if they could very well, be eligible for loan forgiveness in a sole proprietor, or I would guess partnership situation. That was the interim final rule for independent contractors and sole proprietors. They are eligible, as Zach just pointed out. So it depends for that questioner. I really would want a little bit more information as to whether that person was on the payroll, or how are they how did they get paid.
So we have 8 weeks to spend on payroll. Can we do a large payroll once by the end of the 8 weeks, or do we have to be on a specific payroll schedule?
The law doesn't require any special, weekly, bi-monthly, whatever. It just, as long as they have payroll records that are showing what needs to be shown, that will be fine. So, I'm sure some people pay, every 2 weeks, some people pay, weekly, so everybody's going to have the records according to how they are set up. But the most important thing is having the records that clearly show everything that needs to be shown, as far as, what the pay was, the people, everything that we went over. Just find that.
I would advise the person considering that to consult with their lender to ensure that it doesn't look like they're trying to pay them more for the final couple of weeks of their 8-week forgiveness period, for purposes of masking the fact that those employees weren't actually on the payroll for the beginning of the period. And if that were the case, for example, if the employees weren't brought back at all for the first 6 weeks, brought back only for the last 2 weeks, and then paid for a full 8-week equivalent amount at the end of those 2 weeks, you're going to want to make sure that the lender is on board with that, and that you're doing everything you need to meet their forgiveness qualifications.
Yes.
What if we do not use all the money? Will we be penalized because it changes the ratio?
Well, if they don't want to get, if they're not using all the money, they can certainly give money back, or they can let the monies roll over to a loan, and take a couple years to pay back that money if they would like. We are hearing some of our, sorry, Renee, we are hearing from some clients who, after finding out more information, in some cases are deciding that they are not going to take the loan, or are going to give back the monies that they received. So it really is up to the owner. It's business, case by case basis, how the business, what they would like to do.
What if you hired a new employee which was brought on during the pandemic? And what if you go over the 75% portion for the payroll?
So for full loan forgiveness, 75% of the loan, needs to be the payroll costs. So if they go over that's okay, I would guess. You know, the way it was set up, they wanted at least 75% to be spent on payroll to fulfill the spirit of the law, and then they made the other 25%, you know, available for other expenses. But I don't know that there's any reason why they couldn't go over the 75%. Renee, if I could just interject, I'm sorry to interrupt, but again, we always want to keep reiterating and saying to our listeners that they do want to, you know, get this endorsement, whatever we're saying, you know, they want to go back to their bank and just make sure that the bank is in agreement with, you know, that they can have all of their records, but they want to go to the bank and just have the bank hopefully ahead of time be able to give them more clarity. So if they realize that they're going to be, you know, 85% payroll costs, you know, go back to the bank and just make them aware that this is how we're tracking, and do they see any issues with that. So we, you know, we're in the same situation as our clients and as our banking resource partners, as far as being able to, you know, answer a lot of the questions that the accountants are. We have a lot of accountants that have tapped into us, you know, wanting answers, and it's tough when we don't know in a lot of cases. So I do want to keep mentioning that to everyone.
Are bonuses, stipends for internet during work at home, and time and a half as hazard pay allowable payroll and or expenses?
I don't have the answer to that. That may be something they want to talk with their accountant about.
What happens if someone quits? Is that held against you in the head count, or if someone's on leave of absence?
Well, if you brought someone back, or they were already still employed and they quit, you want to be able to show that you are keeping that same head count. Otherwise, it could affect your percentage of loan forgiveness. So that's a really good question. I would hope that people at this time, if they're already employed, would want to stay employed, and if they weren't employed and were laid off, that they would want to come back and stay, you know, with the employer. But you know, you never know. You know, somebody gets upset or whatever and walks off a job. That firm would want to make sure that if they want to get the full forgiveness, that they get that head count to where it was for the base period.
Just to add to that, Roxanne, everything that SBA has provided us would seem to indicate that forgiveness is directly related to and proportional to actual payroll expenses. And so in the event that an employee quit and their position was not immediately refilled by the business, that business's payroll expense is going to be lower as a result. And so forgiveness should proportionally decrease along with decrease in payroll expense.
Right. That's so
true.
It
should not necessarily result in a penalty to the business because they're both paying less in payroll and also having less payroll forgiven. Again, I'd qualify that by that what the SBA has shown us so far would seem to indicate that reduction would be proportional. But being that we haven't seen the formulas that the banks will be using, it is ultimately a question to ask the lender.
Yes, absolutely. I'm always thinking of and trying to, you know, have the business position themselves for that maximum forgiveness. But that's very true that, you know, we have a couple clients that they know they're not going to meet that 75% in payroll costs, and that's okay. You know, as Zach pointed out, you know, the amount will be prorated, and that's fine.
You might have just covered this. I was reading while you were talking about it, so apologies. Do they base a percentage on actual loan amount or on the amount of the loan used?
The percentage for maximum
75% used.
I think that this person may be asking as to whether the 75 to 25% ratio of payroll to non-payroll expenses is based on the full loan amount, or whether it's based on the amount of the loan that is utilized. And the answer to that question would be that it's based on the amount of the loan that is being utilized and for which forgiveness is being requested.
Thank you for clarifying, Zach. I think you're spot on. And if If they have follow-up questions to that, they can definitely reach out to your office. This person's a seasonal business. How are my FTEs calculated? I may not be able to open for the season until July. My average 2019 payroll numbers included my seasonal employees, which may not be the case in 2020.
So they're basing it on including the seasonal employees, and their 8-week period will not have the seasonal employees. So
yeah, they probably won't have as much because the season's starting later.
and that's okay. As we've already talked about, they would just be prorated, based on people that they do bring back or have hired. Actually, you know what? There was something, hold on one sec, about seasonal employees in a prior webinar. Trying to think what that was. Again, I'm going to go back to saying, consult with their bank on that. And they could also, you could actually, Shelby in our office is very up on all of the special cases when it comes to the seasonal workers, so we could run that by her. Zach, can you add to that?
I agree with what you said, Roxanne, that they may just need to operate with the understanding that they're not going to receive as much forgiveness because they're just not going to have those payroll expenses. Of course, if they included an owner's draw as part of the compensation that was used to calculate their eligible amount to receive through the PPP program, they should be able to continue to pay themselves at that average rate if that draw was calculated over a 12-month period, despite the fact that their employees may be seasonal. They may end up in a situation where they're paying themselves over the 8 weeks, but not any of their seasonal employees.
Thank you, Zach.
Roxanne and Zach, I think you mentioned when you don't meet the bank's threshold, that converts to a loan. Is that correct?
When you don't meet what thresholds, Renee?
The 25-75 split.
Well, when I talked about converting to a loan, that would be, I was talking about if at the end of their 8-week period and they go for forgiveness, and let's say that they are left with a certain amount that they aren't getting reimbursed, that will turn into a loan eventually if it's not paid back.
Are health insurance premiums included in payroll?
They are.
For the docs you need to get the lender, is there a good place that we could point someone for a list of those?
They should talk to their bank about what the bank will require. So certainly, their payroll records, but they want to make sure that they prepare and provide records that are going to show everything that the bank's going to need in order to be able to make a decision on the loan forgiveness. So we don't yet have a comprehensive list. What I provided in the PowerPoint was right from the interim final rule as to what would be needed. We don't have such a list, but they could certainly see if it's in their loan document that they signed. And if it isn't, then that's definitely something I would, be in communication with the bank on, so that they can be preparing it as the weeks go by and have it ready at the end of the 8-week period.
Do you know if a franchisee fee can be included as rent?
I don't know that would be considered rent when they're talking rent. When it says out of the interim final rule, it says rent or lease. So we've taken that to mean, a physical property, renting an office location or leasing an office location. Franchisee fee, I've never seen that delineated as an eligible expense. I don't know that would be something eligible for forgiveness. They could double check with the bank though and see. We don't want to discount something that could be a possibility.
I'm going to ask if they can get a copy of this webinar. As soon as we are done, we edit it and we do send that out in an email. That's typically done within 1 to 2 business days after the webinar. We can try to get that out as soon as possible. And Zach, we had a few questions about how folks sign up for your newsletter. If you want to put that in the chat or respond to those folks directly.
Yeah, I also put it on a slide to text MBSBDC to 22828. So as I said, we do put out that newsletter once a week on a Thursday afternoon. Zach prepares it throughout the week, and then we let it go every Thursday afternoon. And we put in there, normally what goes in there is anything that could be of interest to a small business, such as maybe changes in regulations, certainly upcoming training events, not only that we offer, but that our resource partners offer. Procurement news, we have the government contracting coordinator, Gina, on our staff, and so we've got a contracting communications section, which, these last, 6-7 weeks, we've really focused the entire newsletter on the COVID programs, the COVID assistance that's in place for small businesses. So we've gotten away, because we know that everybody is really just focused on trying to stay in business and trying to weather this storm. But when we get back to somewhat of normalcy, everyone, will continue to see all of the great pieces of information and all that we include in the newsletter. So it's our way of communicating anything that we feel would be important to a business person or an entrepreneur. We'll put it in there, and we're very thankful to our resource partners, people like Mohawk Valley Edge, Herkimer County IDA. They will all share information with us. Women's Business Center will tell you about what they've got coming up. In fact, I'll put a plug in here. Herkimer County IDA is going to have a grant program coming up, so stay tuned for information on that. But it's right now it's important because, like I said, anything that we hear about or changes to these programs, that's where we're communicating them. What we could do, Renee and Zach, is I've put up there our intake form link, and Zach, if you'd put that in the chat box, if people want assistance, that's what we appreciate they're using. But even if they just want to ask a question, it could come through that link.
This is one we might not have discussed, actually. I'll throw this one at you for the last one, Roxanne, if that works. What if the state doesn't allow us to open by June 30th?
Well, Zach actually made a really good point earlier when he made the point that employers are welcome to utilize this program and the funding to pay their people even though they can't be open. We've talked with several clients that are actually doing that, and what we've actually told a few of them, can't speak for all of our advisors, but I've told a couple clients to get creative, and if you're going to put somebody on the payroll, find things that they can do that help during this period that we're in right now, and get ready for that time when we could open up fully. So maybe it's a special project that the owner hasn't been able to get to. Maybe it's increasing their social media footprint, making a few live videos to post. The business owners, a lot of them are taking this time to come up with things like that and ways to stay in touch with their clients and their customers. So even though I realize we could be in a situation where we're not going to be fully open by June 30, it's up to that individual business owner to decide, whether to, put the people back on the payroll and pay them. I did have one client, I know she's watching today, where she actually asked about, she's kind of in a construction kind of a business, and she asked about if one person could go and do a job. And we asked that question and found out that even if it were just a sole proprietor, if it was an employee of a corporation, they could go and do, if it was just one person. Like my husband works for a company where they talked about maybe having the warehouse guy go in and do some cutting of carpet. So it's up to the business owner to answer that question as to whether or not they want to utilize the PPP funds to pay their people. You know, whether they're open or whether they're not. You know, hopefully we're looking at in the next couple of weeks, you know, starting to gradually semi-open under certain stipulations and restrictions. But I totally understand that some, you know, it's could be later, you know, and we've talked to a lot of people and I've heard a lot of sad stories. I talked with a woman and her husband. They've had a shop for like 40, 50 years, and you know, she's just desperate to open, and she said, why can't I just put a sign on my door that says you have to wear a mask and you have to, you know, use antiseptic and all that. And I said, you know, to her, you know, she's got things that people need to pick up that she's worked on, and I said, you know, get creative, do like the restaurants do, and make arrangements with those customers that, you know, to come to your curbside, and you'll bring them, you know, the things that you fixed for them. And so I guess my point is just, you know, to try and, you know, do whatever they can do to survive this time and be ready. If you want to brainstorm with one of our advisors to get ready for when we can fully, you know, ramp up, you know, that's what we're here for, is to just be a sounding board and someone to maybe, you know, help get the juices flowing as to, you know, what people can do.
Well, thank you so much, Roxanne. I really appreciate it, and thank you, Zach. We've got lots of thank yous from folks on the webinar as well. I really appreciate the information.
Thank you all for joining today. We appreciate it.